Let's talk about the first time people confronted COVID, their organizations and themselves. And speaking of that, everyone everywhere, given how distributed the fellows are, can you talk to us about the first time your organization started thinking, your circus started thinking about COVID-19?
Sure. I think there were a few threads of parallel work sort of starting to come together. From an organizational point of view, there was the coming together of what we call a team of team structure. It's like not any one team, but someone from talent and from one country in Europe, and different teams, somebody coming together to form a team of these larger teams. And say, look, what's happening, and thinking about staff well-being, thinking about fellow well-being, thinking about organization, like as an organization, how should we respond? But to your point on how distributed the fellow network is, it was actually, became clear quite rapidly that it was going to allow us sort of bird's eye view into community responses. One of the things we've seen is news isn't equally reliable. From everywhere around the world, and we're not necessarily hearing all the right stories. And so the fellows became really powerful nodes around the world, sort of lifting up the voices of communities and how communities were springing into action in response to COVID. And it's been interesting because we fund fellows that are doing systems changing work, right? But there is a spectrum of work, and so you have somebody that works in the open source community, for example, in Spain, that decided that, after a couple of weeks in lockdown, that they've got to respond. So there's sort of this view of what is the best way to invite the community to step into roles of change making instead of passive spectators to this experience that we're all undergoing. And so they sort of mobilized a coronavirus maker forum, and they're 3D printing ventilators and other equipment and on calls with local hospitals and figuring out what is needed. So we started to see those kinds of stories bubbling up. And I think acting as really powerful pieces of information when people are figuring out how should we organize our responses, both in the immediate and then as we now start to think about the future, what are these foundations that are being laid out for a new world?
That's great. And I guess speaking of that sort of bubbling up and the origin, Jess, talk about plan. And how early you all started thinking about it, which I think may be among the earliest in this group.
I think at first Plan started seeing it more as a regional intervention. I don't think anyone in this place expected this to go global this fast. I sit in Panama, but my team is actually in the Philippines. So I was aware that all these measures were being taken in place. A lot of the WHO recommendations were being considered. Some travel was being restricted, and also the most vulnerable points in the organization, which are our communities, were also being analyzed to, if this were to go like up to scale, what would happen and how we could still be able to support our communities. But particularly our region, it was impacted when the case reached Brazil. Our security advisor is Italian. So from the moment that this exploded in Italy, he was very aware in trying to implement all these early measures. So the travel was suspended. The community work was temporarily on hold, just to see how we could still, support our communities without bringing the risk to the communities. So as an organization as a whole, it was actually March when the work from home was implemented, but it was also going back to our strategy, because Plan's mandate is to be with the most vulnerable. So the core of our work is to be able to support girls and young women and to make sure they're safe. So it was also going back to our strategy and finding ways that we could still support them without putting them into risk. So we had to reevaluate a lot of the programs. Each country went into writing their own emergency response plan, into analyzing what can we do, how can we support, what's our capability, how can we collaborate with the government. So some countries were focused more on behavioral change and the communication aspect, and some were focused more on supporting the health sector and like the hygiene, delivering hygiene kits, for example. My work specifically, since I work more on the youth employment side, it's been trying to find ways in that we can still build the resilience of the communities, of young entrepreneurs, of all those young people that were part of our programs that right now are their own holds, just to try to build that resilience in the meantime while we can't directly involve them in the programs.
That's great. And we've heard a few conversations about the World Health Organization, and you talked about sort of the organization monitoring and following the WHO. David, you all have similar experience at the UN, started with the WHO, obviously.
Yeah.
Way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so when particularly early this year in January, as the situation was developing, of course, to your point, we are one agency within the larger UN system. So we were following WHO's lead at the time, and obviously still now. And obviously, even more so now, that has made its way up to the Secretary General. So when we talk about UNCDF's response, it's really in the context of a larger UN response and a larger UN value proposition in terms of a COVID-19 response. Having said that, I think once it became clear that there could be, and frankly we're seeing it now, real impact in the context of LDCs, including Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, Asia Pacific. That's obviously where we were starting to think about how we can repurpose our capacities. And the reason for that was, I mean, it's twofold. Number one, for obvious reasons, when you talk about the LDCs, these are countries that are the most susceptible, or likely the most susceptible to the virus, because they have inadequate health systems. They typically have inadequate local finance systems to support a robust COVID-19 response. But what also became clear to us is that there's also a connection between the impacts of COVID-19 and the Sustainable Development Goals, which for us is really the prism with which we view our mission. And just in a very easy example of that, when you look at economic growth among LDCs last year, it was at about 7%, which outpaced global growth. But what most development economists will tell you is that you need a higher rate of growth if we're going to achieve SDG 1 of eliminating extreme poverty. Now, obviously, if every economic forecast indicates that we're going to have economic contraction this year, and for how long? I mean, we're just kind of in a black box in that regard. So we're talking really not just about the immediate economic impact, but really the potential to undercut the SDG agenda. And if we don't get that economic growth that we need, we're looking at a potential future where maybe a third of the LDC population will live in extreme poverty. So from an agenda that was focused on eliminating extreme poverty, we now have to consider interventions to ensure that we don't have, in fact, the maintenance, if not the uptick of it, because of COVID-19. So yeah, so the journey, the journey was, I think it was, it started slow, then all of a sudden, I think, is the old Hemingway line, but it's actually just been very fast, and it continues to be fast.
Yeah, I think we're seeing that. I think it's and that's fascinating, going how the priorities change from like elimination to now mitigation, right? Which is powerful. I mean, Greg, you see this in Hawaii and in the Philippines, where you sort of have a diversity and wide range of infrastructures and problems and challenges. So how did you all approach this, and how were you affected by this at the outset?
Yeah, no, I mean, it was first just looking at the travel and the spread. And I think, just as a full disclosure, I actually lived in Vietnam during SARS and just afterwards, and done H1N1. So it wasn't totally like unfamiliar to me. Like I was kind of, and in the risk category of all that, I have a pretty high tolerance for risk. So it was mainly at first just sharing information with people and making sure they felt comfortable doing their own personal risk analysis with travel, and how comfortable do you feel? What are your health issues? Looking at things like that. But then as Jessica was saying, as it began to spread faster and faster, and you were just like, oh my gosh, we're really not ready for this. And I think then it became as a kind of foundation that funds. We have about 50 partners, I guess we fund in both places. It's really one taking reassuring them, because I think they're very worried about their funding, their communities, their life. So just taking a reassuring tone with them, and really looking at sort of letting know there's flexibility, and how are we going to kind of get to the end mark here. So I think that's sort of where we went at it.
Great. I love hearing about the focus on values, focus on sort of recommitting to values and priorities, reevaluating. All that stuff is great. And I think, Bo, that resonates with you. Some of your feedback was, instantly we turned to the community that was impacted, and we wanted to respond to community needs. Can you talk a little bit about that, having that clarity?
Yeah, for sure. So for those that haven't come across Humanitarian OpenStreetMap, like essentially we do mapping through OpenStreetMap, which is open source map. It's kind of like Google, but totally open source, and anyone can contribute. If you imagine like Wikipedia and Google had a baby, this is what OSM is. And so for our organization, we have a volunteer base of about 200,000 members of our community who are out there like actively mapping for areas in crises. I think the thing that really caught us off guard was we're very good at fast response, and this was a slow burn. So it was very much like, when do we get into it? Like our communities were impacted. Some of the hot communities were kind of saying, what can we do? How can we contribute? And there's a lot of people who were then shut inside. So they wanted to kind of contribute remotely or be able to help others. And so we kind of were getting a lot of requests, but we didn't know how to respond to them. And I think that was coming from our community first and foremost, our own staff, the projects that we run, and then a lot of our private sector partners as well. And we wanted to be able to respond, but knowing that everybody is responding, we also didn't want to do anything that was like, redundant or duplication. And so I think one of the great things about the way HOT's set up is that it's a very decentralized community-led organization. So the first project we actually did was very local. We provided a kind of quick grant to a group in Cusco, and we enabled them to define what their need was, and that was emergency services, mapping for that purpose, and then they could get that going. So it was like, very much like from the ground led in our response. And we're in a full activation, but the difference for us as well with this one is it's a very extended one. Like a normal activation for us would be like 6 months, maybe max. We react quickly and we help mobilize really quickly. But for this, we've announced 12 months. So yeah, it's kind of like it's a slow burner taken off, and we're just trying now to be there for the long term.